This is Cold Start.
Or wait, is this really Cold Start? Is this real or just a simulation?
See, I feel like simulators nowadays are just so much more prevalent. Like back when I was younger, being in the simulation was like more of a movie Hollywood concept, The Matrix, all those lovely things. And nowadays they're pretty prevalent, especially in motorsports. We talk about driving on the sim all the time.
We've been playing video games a really long time, so making the leap into the sim wasn't that great for a lot of us who were out there on our PlayStations or Xboxes playing Gran Turismo or whatever your favorite title was. And that sort of trained us all for the driving game. The sim has just taken it to the next level of realism and feedback and all this stuff that helps to make it more of an experience.
Video games, driving games, stuff like that, like I would never call those simulations because their point was to be fun, exciting, right? Maybe Gran Turismo was the one out of all of them that tried to take it more seriously to be like the simulation, right? I think that was probably their tagline on their game as well.
They had the name, right? They were trying to tap into the nostalgia for the movie and the Italian spirit of racing, the Gran Turismo.
Which now, like the things that we talk about when we talk about simulations or simulators or driving simulators is predominantly things like Assetto Corsa, iRacing, and still Gran Turismo. Gran Turismo still has a space in this for the sim stuff, but another big piece that got added on top of that is not only the software side of it, but the hardware, right? Of having a sim rig, having a steering wheel, pedal box, and if you can afford it, the whole like frame with the seat and everything else, and you have this whole like mini car sitting in your living room.
Yeah, it's gone from an activity for a hobbyist to something that professionals use for their training and refreshing, not unlike what we hear professional pilots require for keeping their training up, because it's just too expensive and too costly and too risky, frankly, to do all the training in a giant commercial jetliner. So we've come up with these tools and these approximations of the real things that have gotten better and better to the point where now it's pretty darn good. And there is specialized hardware that helps you elevate that experience from, okay, I'm playing through the controller on my Xbox and maybe I'm moving what feels like a realistic car in terms of the physics of the car and the environment in which it is, but the interface isn't so good. So now we want to take that next step to making this feel like it's a real car.
Yeah, I thought it'd be fun for us to talk about maybe our relationship with driving in the sim or using simulators. You know, what is our personal experience? What are our rigs that we've been able to do? What have we done with that platform itself? And then maybe giving some advice of, you know, you have a sim rig, I have a sim rig. What are our advice to people that are thinking about getting into this space? They're car enthusiasts. Maybe they do track days and they've always wanted their own sim rig at home. And then we'll get into that conversation, that overarching thing of like, how has the simulator in regards to driving, racing, and motorsports started to change the whole environment of motorsports in general, and what that ladder looks like of how do drivers use it as a training tool? Is it a good tool to help, you know, train young drivers to then get into motorsports? We'll dive a little bit deeper into that on the tail end. But first and foremost, what's your experience with the sim?
Well, for me, this is just an outgrowth of video games. That's how I came up playing driving games, racing games, on the Atari console, on the Sega console, on the Nintendo console, whether it was Test Drive or Forza or Gran Turismo or whatever your favorite title was, would always gravitate to those as just a fun way to spend the time and, you know, have some approximation of the feeling like of being in a car or racing, what have you. They weren't particularly realistic. It never felt like you were in a race so much as you were dodging obstacles or trying to speed run through a course or something like that. And of course, maybe at maximum you'd play against one other player. Like if it was a pretty advanced title and they could accomplish the computing power necessary back in those primitive games to have multiple cars being controlled on the screen at the same time versus having them be all, you know, non-player characters or what have you. So that was my start. And as these things started getting better and better, I sort of fell away from and then came back into the whole world of racing and video games to the point where I re-entered in sort of Xbox era around Forza, right in anticipation of getting to go drive on a proper racetrack and wanting to have some training before I went and did that. So it kind of forced me back into the space that I'd been out of for a little while, and it caused me to re-engage in the video game still, you know, Forza on the Xbox. But that made me feel like this isn't quite what I need to actually use it as a tool for learning and training to go to a racetrack. So
it still felt like a game.
it felt totally like a game. Like even just the precision of the controller and moving around on the track felt so off. It wasn't at all like being in a car where, the level of fine-grained precision we have through a steering wheel and our pedals. Here we are trying to do that with this kind of clunky hand-based interface and just couldn't do it. So in wanting to pursue further racing and having started going to track days and talking to friends and colleagues about how do they practice, what do they do, track days are expensive, how do you get better at this thing faster? The idea of a simulation rig, a dedicated pit of hardware that you have in varying levels of sophistication, but that was floated as the idea of, well, if you can just get this software, and there's multiple titles, some of the ones you mentioned, and there's different levels, I'll say, of a computer and a monitor and controllers that you could connect up together and then approximate this effect of driving on different racetracks in different cars. And by this point, things had gotten more sophisticated. So we always had the lobby where we could kind of choose what kind of car we wanted to drive. That was a fun part of this. And maybe even choose which course of the few courses that were built into the game that we'd want to drive on. But this next elevation of true simulation of driving took the racetrack to that next level where we would start to see laser scanned approximations of racetracks in the real world put into the video game. So now no longer was it just the cartoon representation of Laguna Seca, it was the actual turns and elevation changes and bumps and features of Laguna Seca that we were seeing in those titles. So that's sort of my indoctrination to simulation racing. It was through the iRacing title primarily. I did get some experience in R Factor 2 and Assetto Corsa primarily, and I would switch between those platforms because there was a specific car I was looking for or a specific racetrack I wanted to go to, and they just weren't all present in all the titles. So just like the other video games, if the car you wanted to drive on wasn't in that game, you found the other game that had the kind of car that you wanted and you used it. And the same idea. I wanted to drive this prototype sports car. It only existed in R Factor. I could only use that at certain racetracks I was going to go drive at in R Factor, so I used R Factor for that. One thing that I realized was lacking there compared to, for example, iRacing was the community side.
Yeah.
There were online multiplayer races in R Factor, but iRacing and Assetto Corsa had developed these communities that have gotten so much larger. The idea of using iRacing as a software title went away from just video games and practicing to being in a place where you're now with other people in real time doing the same thing. And that was a huge change in the experience of being part of a race next to other people who are also doing it with you and not just simulated computer versions of other humans made a huge change in that. So that's sort of an abbreviated version of how I got into doing this in the first place and why I took the step from the video game, less realistic, to simulated, more realistic racing title and platform. Then I went down the path of buying hardware as you do, and you can go down the rabbit hole of how much you want to spend and how complicated you want it to get. But my goal initially was get something that was within my budget that could give me an approximation of driving on the racetrack so that I could get practice doing that when I'm not there. And I can practice doing it at places where I haven't yet been if I'm going to drive there sometime in the future. And I'd like to have some insight into it before I show up just driving cold.
Yeah, and I think that's like a huge difference that happened of like moving from the video game engagement and like you're saying with like the controller, which I mean, moving your thumbs on a controller has no correlation to like how you actually drive a car. And I feel like for me, when I had video games, which I wasn't allowed to have very many as a child, most of them were driving games, racing games. Mm-hmm. And I remember as a kid, all I wanted was the little like Logitech steering wheel, like something to make it more realistic. And even, way back when that Logitech wheel and pedals, it wasn't necessarily like the most realistic thing. The wheel itself is probably half the size of a real steering wheel and all that sorts of stuff. But just changing from using your thumbs to actually using your hands and the motion then translating to what the car is actually doing on the screen, like that's massive. And things have progressed so quickly and exponentially over the last handful of years. It's gotten crazy. And I feel like my engagement with simulators, like it took me a while to get into something that was like, pretty legit.
Yeah.
You know, as a kid, I never got the wheel. I never got the pedals. I was fine enough using my thumbs and like obsessed with racing games and driving games and all that sorts of stuff, but just never was able to make that investment into it. Now, when I was living down in Southern California, the first time that I had experience of like having access to a simulator whenever I wanted, essentially, was my roommate that I had down there. He inherited a sim rig, which then ended up in the house that we lived in the living room. And so, of course, the two of us would, you know, compete with one another and be able to drive. And it was everything I wanted it to be of like the young version of myself. So this was probably like, you know, maybe 5 years ago at the most, I had access to one, and like how much that I fell in love with that experience. And at this point, I'd driven on track for a while, and, you know, just having access to something that's so much more convenient that you can drive and like push yourselves and learn new tracks and try different cars. I don't have to go through all this energy to do this like out in the real world, and like all of the money and time you have to spend to go and do track days. I can now do that in the comfort of my living room, and like it just seemed like such a great thing, great addition as a car enthusiast.
Yeah, and obviously these things are oriented toward the performance side of vehicles and driving, right? There are very few, you know, supermarket, grocery store parking lot simulators out there because nobody wants to do that kind of driving. Right. But what's happened is over time, the realism of the experience of being in the car, being at those places, being among other cars has gotten more and more advanced. And this is the outgrowth of the video games where it was an approximation to the point where we could tell it was pretty unrealistic. Like when you move a controller around and the lag that existed between your movements and the things the cars were doing, or just all of those things that failed to meet the test of this is like actually driving a car. Once you cross that line and you have the dedicated hardware, the rig, maybe we should talk a little bit about what a sim rig is for those who are less familiar with it. Just at its base, it's a computer with a monitor or some screen that you can look at. Maybe it's VR goggles. And it's some interface, whether it's the controller, hopefully better than that, steering wheel, and brake pedal and throttle pedal at minimum so that you can engage with this thing like it's a car. And the idea is that you turn the wheel and you push the pedals like you would if you were in a car, and you're looking at the screen to get a sense of what's ahead of you and what's around you, just like you would if you were driving, looking at the front windshield of a car. One of the problems, though, is, of course, when you're driving in a road vehicle or at the track, you're seeing much more than what's just outside your front windshield. So that introduces this idea of now maybe you need multiple monitors, maybe you need the VR goggles. It gets complicated really quickly to really achieve a true level of simulation in a realistic way versus an approximation that's kind of realistic.
Yeah, and that's like how far you want to take it, right?
Yes.
And I think that like in regards to sim rigs, like there is such a spectrum, because at the very beginning, you could just have, you know, the steering wheel, the pedals, and it's attached to a desk, and you're sitting in a desk chair, and you have a monitor in front of you and a computer running the software. But then you can go as far to like, you know, completely recreating the internal cockpit. I've seen some crazy stuff online of people basically like recreating the inside of whatever car that they prefer the most. And it looks like they're actually in a car.
Or even buying a show car or a crashed tub of a proper race car and converting that into the chassis, if you will, of a sim rig, turning the proper actual race seat into, or the race chassis, the tub of the car, into the race sim rig itself. You can go to that point. Now, you're decreasing the comfort level of your home environment that you're using to get in your car. You're increasing the potential that it's going to be hard to manage or have other limitations like a car would, but in some ways it's a much more realistic environment if you're actually trying to use this thing for training, such that you might be in a car shaped like this, or that feels like this, or that's this size, translating the skills that you're trying to build in the simulated version of it.
So there's a huge spectrum of like how much you want to get involved in making a sim rig. And maybe this is a good time to talk about the rigs that we made. How did we make decisions of how far to take it? Because I had access to the sim rig when I was living with my roommate. I obviously moved out. Then I had no longer access to a sim rig, and I was like kind of starting to like itch a little bit of like, man, do I really miss like those like late nights just ripping laps at wherever and trying different cars and new tracks and all that sort of stuff. And racing with people online is so much fun. And so the next time that I was able to have access to a sim rig was actually constructing or starting to build piece by piece, kind of not my own rig, but it was like in collaboration with a friend, and it was on the way to Pikes Peak. I was actually online, like ordering parts to build a sim rig that we were going to assemble in Colorado. So on the off weeks of testing and practicing at Pikes Peak, we would then have a sim rig in our Airbnb to rip laps of the mountain to stay like sharp.
Nice.
And so it was like everything that I learned from my ex-roommate's rig, I was like, okay, these are the things, bare minimum, we need to have if we're actually going to make something that needs to be used as like a tool, right? And I think that's like, depending on your mindset, if you're just trying to have fun, you build a rig to just have fun, do it cheap as you can, and just enjoy it, right? If you need a sim rig to be simulating realistic things, there's certain bare minimums that you then need to get into. And the biggest things that I saw of like, if you want the real car feel within a sim rig, most important thing is going to be the steering feel and the pedal feel. Maybe steering first, pedals second. But the reason why is because within a simulator, your sensory intake is only visual, right? Because unlike driving a real car, you have so many more senses going on of like feeling the car, the G-forces, the vibrations, all these sorts of things that your body tells you if the car is gripped up, not gripped up, if you're locking the brakes, all this sorts of stuff that the simulator really can't give you. And a good steering wheel will actually give you some sort of vibration feedback in the wheel, which can kind of tell you what the tires are doing, but also that force feedback of feeling kind of the pavement and the tires pushing back against your steering. That'll then help, get that feel of the understeer and losing grip or gaining grip, stuff like that. And then I think pedals are second most important because like you get a lot of feedback, especially the brake pedal is so important. It's so important in racing in the real world that your simulator should also simulate the same sort of like brake pressure and being able to like trail the brakes off and that smooth release and all that sort of stuff. So like those were the two main things that I found of like, if you want to build your rig, that's the number two priorities is a good direct drive wheel, none of the belts, none of the chains, none of those things. A good direct drive doesn't need to be top of the line, just introductory, and then a good set of pedals. Like if you want to spend money on pedals.
Yeah, I think the translation of track driving or racing skills to simulated racing must go through the path of having realistic pedal feel, right? When you're driving on the road, the feedback that you get from your brake pedal, from your throttle pedal, I mean, it's minimal. I mean, there's some there. Most cars that are on the road today, people aren't using that. They're just, kind of mashing on those things.
Yeah.
And the racetrack, of course, having sensitivity and a good feel for that initial stab of pressure on the brake pedal and then that trailing off, that ability to trail brake around a corner, doing all those things that requires that level of sensitivity. Yeah, you need something better than just the really basic spring-loaded, Logitech pedal set that doesn't give you any feedback or realistic feel whatsoever. So there are multiple gradations of that. You go from the spring-loaded systems to what they call a load cell-based system, which is kind of like a hard piece of urethane or plastic that's been molded that goes in line behind the pedal below the mechanism where you're actually pressing down with it. And it allows you to adjust or use different kinds of bushings in there to get different levels of sensitivity and pressure from your pedal. And then there's levels of adjustment for how far your pedal should travel, how it hangs, how far it should recede when you press on it, all those kinds of things to make it feel more realistic to the cockpit of a car and how it feels when you're using it in a racing environment. I think those are critical. And then there's an undescribed piece here. People go, I think, correctly to steering and brakes, but there's a third piece, which is what holds it all together, and that's the structural rigidity of the rig itself. You can have a great set of brakes, you can have a great steering wheel, and you mount it to something that flexes, and every time you get on the brakes, they kind of move a little bit, and the whole thing, it ceases to feel realistic at that point, like it would feel like in a car. So I think having something that holds it all together that's structurally strong enough that allows it to stay rigid and doesn't sort of flex under load is pretty important as well. And then the next step, if you're going through brake feel and you've gotten the load cell, they're actually hydraulic systems that have a reservoir and an outboard little actuator for engaging brakes like you would in a proper car. I've even been on a simulator that had an outboard clutch disc, caliper, and rotor that would engage use hydraulic fluid that would be sucked up into the system. And when you got on the brakes, it was literally the braking system of a proper car connected up to a computer that would be engaged in such a way that it created a really realistic brake feel and pedal feel on this simulator. It was pretty incredible.
It's crazy what lengths people go through. Like I've seen rigs like that too, where it's like, yeah, there's actual fluids for the braking system, the clutch system, all that stuff. And it's like, yeah, you can go and just simulate what cars actually do when you hit those pedals in real life and add it to a simulator and put a little sensor on it. And it's like, boom, ready to rock and roll. And I think the point that you made about like the sim frame, like what everything attaches to,
Yeah.
I agree with you 100%. Is like, that is such an important thing, because it's like you could have a really good steering wheel, a really good pedal box, and if you're still sitting in an office chair and that's attached to your desk, and as you hit the brake pedal, you slide yourself back because your seat is on wheels, you're going to lose everything that you're trying to gain there. And
That's right.
And when I was giving advice to build this sim rig, I said, like, we need to have a really stable base. The one that we ended up getting it was a Race Tech base. So like Race Tech, you know them as like they make seats and they make safety equipment for real race cars. This base, it held the monitor, it was able to hold the pedal box. It even had proper like adjustments for everything for the seat. And I think the seat also kind of goes into that of like having a seat that is a real racing seat is also an important thing to give you that feel that you're in that cockpit. Anything that you can do that helps you immerse yourself into that experience is a plus, right? Anything that takes you out of the immersion, that it's not perfectly or doesn't feel 100% like the car does, that takes you out of the simulation and makes you feel like it's a game rather than realistic.
All these things have diminishing returns. There's a point where you can make this as realistic as possible. Okay, you want to go all the way, put on your racing suit, your Nomex, your racing boots, go get your balaclava out, put on your helmet, grab your Hans, get your gloves, now go sit in this thing. Boy, it's going to be really uncomfortable, huh? Just like in a race car. Hey, you're going to get sweaty and you're going to want to get out of that thing. Hey, just like a race car. But the reality is, very few of us, if any of us, actually go through all that effort to do a simulated racing run at home. Yep. I mean, it's one of the nice conveniences, and there's some pros to the simulated racing over real racing that are just really nice conveniences or great capabilities that you gain that you don't have in the real world. And there are drawbacks, of course, and it's easy to focus on the drawbacks. Maybe we should talk a little bit about what are the things that do translate, or what are the things that maybe are even better in the sim environment, maybe in addition to the obvious thing of comfort. You get to sit in your own home, in your own environment. You're not at some dusty racetrack. You don't have to spend a bunch of money staying at a crappy hotel overnight, right? You just roll up to your sim and get in the seat and you go.
Yeah, and I think that like that goes into also the conversation of like, well, what do you use your sim for?
Right.
Like making mine, or like what I use mine mainly for is maybe not that whole diehard seriousness of like put on the suit, put on the helmet, like the diehard training tool, which it can be used for. And there have been times that I've used it for that. But for the most part, like I just want to get on there and have fun. Like driving is fun. Racing is fun. Being in a car and in a competitive environment is fun. Yeah. Now, the thing that I probably do the most on the sim on a weekly basis is I use iRacing mainly. I think everyone that has a sim mainly uses iRacing. But I do a lot of oval stuff, like NASCAR style, whether it's dirt oval or paved oval. The super speedway stuff is really fun and entertaining. I feel like anyone that's ever played NASCAR NASCAR 2004 video game can kind of like understand where this is going, because being in a pack and like wrecking and like watching wrecks or like trying to like make it through wrecks, really exciting. But also I feel like the appeal of doing oval racing is just like, I don't get to do that in the real world, right? Like being able to drive on road courses and different GT cars, it's like, to a degree, I have that opportunity to be able to do that in the real world. But like oval racing, driving a NASCAR, driving in a like draft pack at Daytona, I'll probably never get that opportunity to do that in the real world. But here I can do it on the simulator, and you can trash talk the people next to you and just have a grand old time.
Well, that's a huge aspect of this, which is just the ability to interact with your fellow racers, which is very different than in the real world. And there's a few things here that we have to unpack. So first off, on your regular track day on a road course, you go out there and you're not racing, but there are certain dynamics that approximate racecraft.
Yeah.
Right? You're all going to go leave from pit lane at roughly the same time, and you got to warm up your tires, and there's different cars coming and going off the track, and then you're going to come into a corner approaching another car, and you're going to pass them, and you're going to develop some capability to learn how to pass other cars. But you're never going to gain the capabilities of driving in a pack of cars at near maximum speed in the dynamics that an oval present. I haven't ever been to a track day that was 6 or 8 cars all going 170 miles an hour together in a tight pack around an oval, where one guy's on the high side and the other guy's on the low side, and we're taking risks about going into the wall, and nothing like that. So the sim is great for that, because this now creates an opportunity to be in an environment that you could never otherwise be. That's kind of more like the video game side. Like, I could go be in outer space on a video game where I can't go be in that in real world. So that's what the simulated title is bringing to you, an opportunity to be in a place that you couldn't otherwise be in realistically.
Yeah. And I think that's another thing that I love to do on the sim, which now transitioning over to like Assetto Corsa, which they have a better like drifting platform than iRacing does. Yeah. But like, that's a thing I love to do on that platform, is like, let me try to drift Laguna Seca. Something that like you'll never be able to do in real life, but you're like, I want to practice this. I want to get good at drifting. I want to understand what are some of the sensations that I can get from the simulator of sliding a car, trying to drift it, stuff like that. You know, whether that directly translates to the real world, but like, I don't have access to a drift car in the real world to be able to go and do this stuff, but like, I can do it on the simulator. So like, I feel like that's most of the stuff that I do with my sim, is like just the fun stuff that you don't really get to do in the real world, which like, yes, maybe it is more of that video game side of things where you're just kind of like, there's no consequences, I can just send it. And like, that's not really the point of iRacing. Like, there's so much great stuff to learn. Like you're saying, from the racecraft side of it, of like jumping into an online lobby with a bunch of other people and like learning how to overtake a car, learning how to get overtaken by another car. And like, if you make a mistake and you end up dooring someone, at least in the real world, you would have to pay for crash damage. In the sim world, you might get like, you know, penalized on your iRacing safety rating or whatever it is, but like, you don't have to pay for anything.
Yeah, calibration to risk is definitely different in the sim versus the real world. And it's one of the reasons it does get treated like a video game sometimes, because, you know, the cost of failures, you hit reset, or maybe annoy some other people you're never going to meet again in your life in some online lobby or in a game or something like that. But beyond that, there's all those other aspects of things that you can take away, or those experiences that you can get that are going to be very different than what you can get in real world on the racetrack. Like in that oval circumstance, I imagine iRacing is better than not ever being able to try to be able to do that stuff at all. One of the other things that's really complicated, much like real motorsports, is that you can't be the all-singing, all-dancing platform simulation for all kinds of driving. Yeah. And there's road racing, and there's oval racing, and there's street courses, and there's rally racing, and there's trucks, and there's so many variations. We even talk about dirt and circle track, and there's so many different types of racing. No one platform is going to be really good at all of those.
Yeah.
If I want to go practice drag racing, iRacing isn't going to do anything for me, right? And there's very few platforms out there actually for things like drag racing, because it is so specialized and niche. You need something that can get the critical mass of however many people come out and race GT cars or stock cars or formula cars. Well, there's tens of thousands of those at any point in time, in real time, going on iRacing to go and race. So you can find other people to go have a race with in almost any one of those platforms that we mentioned. But now as you get a little bit more esoteric, you wind up with a lot smaller population, and no one software title can be all those things to all those forms of driving.
Yeah. Now, with your simulator, how did you find yourself using it mostly? Was it something that was like you just jumped on, you just wanted to have fun? Did it ever become a training tool for you of jumping into a new car, new track? Is a simulator viable for training? Have you seen that from personal experience?
Yeah, it is. I first got a simulator at the advice of a friend when I was getting into, just out of Formula 3 driving, starting to get into the LMP3 platform. And the cost of a test day, the cost of the equipment, the cost of operating the vehicle went up significantly.
Yeah.
To the point where when you consider what's your cost of doing a day at a racetrack, you have to take into consideration your ramp-up period. If you're going somewhere you've never been before, you're going to spend, a reasonable part of your day just learning the racetrack, just learning left and right and up and down. So if you can do that in advance of the time that you would spend at that physical place, it can be done a lot more economically, and you get more bang for buck out of the time you're spending for that very expensive experience of being in that kind of car. So that very quickly convinced me, for the price of literally a single one of those test days at a racetrack, I could get a starter racing sim rig for myself and get an approximation of those skills. So that's what I did. And the goal was to become familiar with racetracks that I didn't know yet or I was just learning. And again, get there and at least have my bearings of knowing landmarks, left, right, order of operations. Then it was a matter of, do I know it in this specific kind of car that I'm going to be driving? Because every racetrack feels a little different depending on what kind of car you're in or what kind of vehicle you're going around in. So what was the closest approximation of the vehicle I'd be driving on that racetrack, and can I get that in the simulated environment? And sometimes you couldn't get the exact car, so you just found something that had similar dynamics or properties that might give you an approximation of that. So we did that. And then there was a matter of, is this a place that maybe you've been to before and it's just been a while and you're a little rusty, and it'd be helpful to kind of, refresh yourself, get sharper again with the things that you once knew really well from having driven at a place in the real world, versus a place you've never been before and wanting to prep for it in advance. And I've used it for both of those. So I was going on a track day with some friends at a place called Oregon Raceway Park out in rural Oregon, ORP, if you know the track. And there was damn near zero about this that I could find anywhere. There's very little documentation, very few guides, very few photos, some videos, but not a ton. Well, I did find that there was a version of that racetrack in, I believe it was R Factor 2. It may have been Assetto Corsa, but I'm pretty sure it was R Factor 2. So I was able to load up that track, get a car that seemed somewhat relevant to what I'd likely be driving at that racetrack, and just get a sense of it. And so I was able to do that to the point where when I, for the first time, rolled up at that racetrack in the real world and got on the track and started to drive, there was familiarity there. I didn't have to wonder when that blind turn was coming up next if it was going to be a right or left. I knew because the sim taught me what I needed to know in advance. And so it really advanced my skills, it advanced my confidence in a way more quickly than I would be able to otherwise. And then I took that to the next level once I started racing, I'll say, beyond the club level, and I wanted to go to Europe to go drive on a racetrack I'd never been at before. That was Portimao in Portugal. And once again, I went on the sim, and I used the sim, having had a great experience at ORP, to translate knowing the map of the track to being able to drive on it. I did the same thing with Portimao. And when I showed up at Portimao, it is true that I knew whether to make lefts and rights, but what was not true was the fact that the elevation, the G-force, the physical requirements of that racetrack did not translate at all to the simulated title. And what I learned was basically left and right, but it did not teach me how to drive that track. I spent a good half of the day still adapting what I thought I knew to actually gaining enough knowledge of it to use it in such a way that I could go and drive the car in a more advanced way than I would if I was brand new to that racetrack.
Yeah, I was going to have a follow-up question of going through that process of using the sim as a tool and learning. What were the gaps and where did it leave openings of this didn't really translate from the sim to real world? Because it sounded like your experience at ORP was awesome of I at least knew where everything was going. The visual recognition, like we talked about, that simulator can give you the visual of what the track is going to look like.
That's right.
Where things go. Is this blind? Is there a reference point that I can use? A hill, a discoloration in the pavement. Simulators now are phenomenal. Like you're talking about these scans that they do.
Yes.
You can see these discolorations. You can see, it's kind of funny to say, but if there's a porta potty, the porta potty exists in the real world and exists in the simulator. They scan it in, all that sort of great stuff. And now the example of going over to Europe, that's really interesting to talk about of how there was more of a separation there of, with the car and the track, that a lot of the things that didn't translate over was the physical feeling. And I just think that simulators just can't give you that. And a big piece of advice that I can give to people is do not spend money on simulator stuff that is trying to recreate physical G-force feeling. The whole moving sim, I think, is gimmicky in a sense, because it's like you're never going to fully be able to recreate the G-force that the car has. So if you can't recreate it 100%, it's not going to immerse you. It's going to pull you out. It's going to feel video gamey and stuff like that. And
That's right.
I think that is a big piece that the sim lacks, is like the car feel, the G-force feel, what it takes to drive the track in the real world versus just the game. And maybe even coming in with like a video game mindset to a track to be like, oh, I could do this in the sim, so why can't I do it in the real life? Rather than maybe having that like young, new brain to something to be like, let me absorb what this is giving me in the real world. You're already trying to come up with assumptions that you learned in the sim.
It's the thing that we really don't want at the racetrack in the real world is somebody with false confidence.
Yeah.
And it's really easy and cheap to have false confidence on the iRacing platform because you just restart, you reboot, you got another race.
Yeah.
The consequences are pretty minimal, right? So there's a big gap there. And that G-force is a really big part of it because the feeling of a car, right? We talk about, colloquially, we call it the butt dyno, right? It's the sense that you have in your rear end sitting in the seat of what the car is doing beneath you. And you're lacking that in a static simulator, right? That's just sitting on the ground and you're driving on the simulated racetrack. So for some people, they think the answer is, well, motion. So let's get a simulator that'll move around. The problem is they move around so unrealistically, you're better off not moving at all and focusing on the things that you can take away from the simulation platform to a real race car, one of which is not included the G-forces, and know that that's a gap, versus trying to recreate that, and you're actually working against yourself in some ways. You'll be training against the behaviors that you're actually going to experience, the feelings you're going to get in a real race car. And so I think there's a point where you have to accept certain deficiencies up to a certain budget level. And what we're talking about is there are motion simulators that are used at professional levels of motorsport that cost well into the 7 digits. Yeah. So if you've got well into the 7 digits to drop on a simulator, sure, you should consider motion. But if you're talking about spending thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars on a simulator, even approaching $100,000, which is a crazy amount of money to spend on a racing simulator, you can buy a car for that. But even at that level, you're not going to get realistic motion. Now, there are things that can give you a simulation of the experience that approximate motion, which are useful. So some of the things you'll get are rumblers or base devices. There's earthquake boxes or butt kicker devices that you can get that actually create a vibration that, properly placed around your simulator rig, you can place one under each of where your tires would be. And now you have this device that's going to give you some kind of a force feedback of the feeling that is being created from the tire of the car. And in some cases, there's just a front and a rear, and it gives you a sense of a slip or a slide or a bump or a collision or something that might occur on the racetrack through the simulation platform itself, not just what you see on the screen, but actually a physical response. You're actually feeling through like a giant subwoofer a bump or a vibration in your chassis. There's other things that they have that do stuff like this. There are seatbelt tensioners that you can get, where you actually have seatbelts that you put on in the rig. Again, how realistic do you want to be? I don't put on seatbelts when I get in the rig, but if you want to go that far, you can. And there are devices that can connect up with the software that'll pull the seatbelts tighter under heavy braking or under heavy turns. Now, that might be more realistic for the feeling of being in a car and the G-forces you get, but how much is that really doing for you? You could get a fan that blows wind at you, because on the racetrack, there's air blowing over the car. How far do you go? Do you create weather? Do you heat up the room? Do you put on the racing suit and the helmet? Right? This is one of those things. So it's a matter of accepting what the platform is good and is capable of doing and figuring that out and not going beyond that. And then understanding where there's deficiencies and where I didn't have the experience of knowing those elevations were quite as dramatic as they were. They didn't seem like it on the screen. In the same way that it seems like, well, I just keep my foot completely flat through this turn on the screen, that when I get there in real life, I'm terrified. There's no way I can do this with no consequence, because if I mess up, I'm dead. And I'm not going to take the chances of being dead today just because I'm trying to win a video game.
Right. Yeah. And like, how many people have heard that line of like, well, it's flat in the sim. Why isn't it flat in real life? And it's like, yeah, there's things that translate and there's things that don't. And I think it's really important for people to recognize what sims are good for and where they have blind spots, because it's not going to directly simulate being in a real car. There's just nothing that directly replicates that 100%. I think sims are really good for, visual recognition, finding your reference points, understanding where the track goes, where you need to place the car.
Yes.
Thinking mentally through a lap at a track of, I need to brake at the two board. I need to look here. I need to get the car down to the inside of the corner at this point. Like all of those things, the mental piece of it, you can really work on with the simulator, the visual recognition, where you're trying to place the car, how you're trying to move the pedals, stuff like that. But 100%, you're not going to get like the nuance of the car. You're not going to get the feel of the car. Like that is only going to be in the real world. But just the visual recognition, finding reference points, understanding where you're going next, working on that internal dialogue, that's a huge piece of driving a car, and that gives you a step forward when you have to go to somewhere new. Now, where I really used it was when I went to Pikes Peak for the first time. Rookie, never driven it in real life, went there once with a rental car just to kind of like check it out. But like, you don't have opportunities to practice Pikes Peak at speed.
Yeah, it's not like you can go rent out the track.
Exactly. There is no track day at Pikes Peak. I think this is like the prime example of where a simulator really comes into play, because there are so many people that ask me of like, how do you prepare for that? Like, how do you start memorizing the 156 turns that makes up Pikes Peak? And talking about consequences of like, you miss a turn, you make a mistake, it's not a reset button. It's not even you went into a gravel trap. You launched yourself off a mountain. Mm-hmm. So the consequences are really high. And so leading up to that event, leading up to the month that we were then going to have to go test, if you want to hear more about Pikes Peak, there is a Pikes Peak episode on the podcast. Look for it. It's pretty deep, but we go more in depth of that whole journey that I went through. But leading up to it, on the simulator, on Assetto Corsa, they have a great Pikes Peak simulation. And I would basically run the mountain about, twice a day, 4 times a week for the course of 3 months. And the main objective of running it on the simulator was to memorize it, of what corner's coming up next. In the beginning, I started off with like, where are the big mistake corners? Where is like, alert, you need to brake hard here, making sure that I understood where those were, and then starting to go through of like, where can I start carrying more speed? Is this a medium-sized corner? What's coming up next? Just understanding, and once again, like having that mind be able to think 1 or 2 corners ahead while still keeping the car on track. And for the car that I was going to drive, which was a one-off thing, you can't replicate that in the simulator, right? So like, I couldn't even start to get a feel for like, is this a second gear corner? I wouldn't know that until we would go there in real life. And I just used a car that was like, this feels realistic, and I just want to learn what's coming up next.
Right.
Do I know the mountain? And what I found was like, after doing the sim for so long, we got there in the real world, and it was like kind of the same feeling for the first time of going up the mountain of like, this all looks familiar. Like, I've done this before. I've been here before, even though I hadn't. And and I bring up that funny story about the porta potty, but like, there is a porta potty on Pikes Peak, and like, I got there and I was like, oh my God, it's real. Like, it exists. It's in the simulator. And I got there and I was like, there's that porta potty that exists in this corner. And so like, the visual references in simulators are phenomenal, whether it's a guardrail, a sign, trees, rocks, stuff like that. Like, they do a really good job that you then start noticing those things in the real world. And I think that's where it's really, really strong. But there's definitely those blind spots of like, don't take it as the end all be all of like, I'm going to be on throttle to this point, I'm going to hit the brakes this hard when I'm in the car comparative to the sim, because those things don't necessarily directly relate.
Back to mindset a little bit too, right? Even professionals that we know use the simulator for their own training, for their own purposes. It's a different environment. And what you just explained, the mental process you went through of decomposing the mountain. Where are the places where I might die? Where are the places this could go really, really badly? Make sure it doesn't.
Right.
And then little by little, you get around to the point where like, okay, where can I get some speed? Where can I build where can I get some lap time in here? And it's a process of elimination by which you don't want to be the one who is eliminated.
Right.
With the video game, if you will, with the simulated racing platform, if you were going to go drive Pikes Peak, would you before you even got in the car and drove, step back and say, hold on, now let me do all of this analysis of the race course. Let me understand where the really tricky turns are. Let me then add in these. No, you would just jump in and drive. And when you went off the mountain, you'd hit reset and you go do it again and go, don't go off the mountain there. Right? It's just a totally different approach that you have and a way of thinking about it that you're going to engage in this thing. And I mean, I really have to say, nobody I know, including professional racers, would go about decomposing the process of going up the mountain the way you did in real life if you just threw them in front of a Assetto Corsa and said, go drive Pikes Peak.
100%. Yeah, like think about how many times you would have to run the mountain in real life.
Yes.
Is that even feasible? No. The amount of times that you could do it in the simulator. And same thing, like in real life, you can't go with the mindset of like, just go until something happens and then hit reset. Like you don't have that many cars to be able to do that. And so it's like the amount of test days and laps that you would have to do in the real world to replicate what you can do in your living room on a simulator would be insane. And going back to the whole cost thing of like, yeah, don't waste going out in the real world and doing a test day to learn the track. Mm-hmm. Like that's a waste of time and money. You can start doing those things on the simulator, learning a new track, learning braking markers, learning the visual references, learning the line, and knowing where to place the car. So when you get to the track, you can start at a good base point.
Right.
You're not going to come to the track knowing the racetrack 100%. You're not going to go out there and on your second lap when the tires are warm, set a personal best and put the thing on pole. It's just not going to happen, right? But the simulator just eliminates so much cost in real world motorsports. And I think that's where it has like this inherent value, and like you can do things with the sim that you can't do in the real world. And so like it completely changes this mindset in how drivers can train, how drivers can build skill sets. Like there is a lot to be benefited from simulators. I think they do have a huge place in motorsports nowadays.
Yeah, and that's the huge question here, right? And the one I think on the minds of probably everybody listening or who thinks about or involves themselves in this space is, can I use sim racing, the platform, the software, the tools, the environment, to learn how to drive well enough to go be a professional race car driver? And there's been several examples of this now. But before we jump into that, let's reflect on the fact that just recently, in the past few episodes, we talked about racing schools and the ways by which people might learn how to sort of climb the ladder and build the skills necessary to pursue a professional motorsports career. And in most of those cases, it starts off with a very young kid getting in a go-kart or having some kind of formalized training such that they can get access to the tools and the know-how necessary that aren't always available to people. The sim racing platform now makes that much more accessible. It democratizes the access to those things for people. So it just changes the mechanism by which people can now get up onto the ladder of learning these skills. But let's talk about what people learn in go-karting that's different than what they learn in a simulator, and how much or how useful is one of those versus the other ones. And then let's talk about some examples of where this has actually happened.
Everyone thinks about getting into motorsports. If you want to go be a professional race car driver, you have to start when you're 7 years old go-karting, right? We've all heard this of like, oh, did you start in karts? Or like, how long did you go-kart? All that sort of stuff. Well,
or if you're Lewis Hamilton, you start out on RC cars because you're not old enough to go-kart yet.
It starts with the Hot Wheels when you're 2, and then it keeps progressing from there. But this whole conversation about go-kart, I never go-karted, right? So I skipped that step. Mm-hmm. And like I've always looked at karts kind of with like a, maybe a negative mindset or whatever the case is. But a lot of people, or a lot of stories that I've heard from go-karting and kids transitioning from go-karts into cars is there's not a lot of crossover, because the way that you have to drive a go-kart to be fast, it has nothing to do with driving a car fast. Mm-hmm. All of the feel stuff, the way that you have to turn the cart, the way that you have to flex the chassis, all that stuff, like that doesn't translate to a car in any sort of way. And this whole left foot braking, not necessary in a car, or the way that you shift, there's not a lot of things that really translate to actually driving and racing a car when you get to that step. The things that kids learn in karting, one is, how does motorsport work as a whole?
Right.
Whether that's practice, qualifying, race, just the logistics.
The organization and process.
The team to mechanic to driver relationship, racecraft, how to take a green flag, how to take a checkered flag, just like the whole process of a race.
And sportsmanship too, right? A lot of young people
Yeah.
coming up, it's a way to learn how to compete and that you don't always win.
And maybe consequences of like when you make a mistake, you're going to hit a wall and it's going to hurt. And like, then things cost money. But there really isn't that much in my mind that like, translates into racing where it's like, you have to go go-karting, right? And I think that that's where this conversation of like, what if we substitute a simulator for these young kids rather than karting? I think that there's a viable swap that can happen. If you take a 9-year-old and you just throw them in a simulator and you're like, all right, learn everything on the sim, racing line, how to handle the car, feedback from the wheel, pedals, racecraft through online racing. There's a lot of things there where like then where they would transition to a car, it's a direct translation. Things feel the way that they should feel. They look the way that they should look. The only thing that you would really have to teach the kid at that point is like, hey, if you make a mistake or you do something stupid, it's not just a reset. There's going to be like real consequences here. You can't just treat it like, you can be reckless. But if you kind of put that emphasis on them in the early phases of their development, I don't know. I think that sim racing could replace karting to a degree, like except for the physicality of it.
Yeah.
Or even in racing schools, I think sims can be like replace a lot of like the racing stuff of like teaching people. You can talk about visualization, the mental side, racing line, braking points, how to brake. I mean, even in sims, you can download data. Like you can look at people's brake traces from a simulator, throttle traces, steering traces. Like you have all this built-in information. Like if you're an instructor, you can do a lot of developing a driver in the virtual world and do it for a lot cheaper with a lot less consequences and then slowly build them into the real world.
There's becoming a lot more overlap too, right? So to the point where your iRacing software connected up into your sim rig, you can connect up Motec software and sensors, and the i2 software that you would use in a proper race car. You'd get out of your Porsche Cup car, plug in the laptop, use the same software to analyze your performance as you can in iRacing. To the point where I've been there with my race engineer who was in real time looking at the telemetry coming out of the iRacing software when I was on the racing rig, and they were able to give me feedback about that. That was huge. One thing that will never happen from a simulator, though, at least in my belief, is that those other softer skills that you were talking about, the ability to compete and be part of a racing organization, be part of an association of people doing this thing together, following rules, sort of developing those interpersonal, interhuman values, right? That's not developed in iRacing as far as I can tell at all. There's a little bit of reputational impact if somebody does something good or bad or otherwise, but that's something that in the real world people develop that they don't in the platform. But that said, the thing that I think karting gets substituted for as a term that we're looking to develop in young people up and coming, and when we talk about, all those pros must have been karting from when they were young kids, is hand-eye coordination. The ability to take the feeling you get in that butt dyno, in your hands, in your body, from a vehicle, whether that's a cart or a bicycle or a motor vehicle, and translate that into a response. If the car moves this way, what can I do to move with it, gain control of it, overcome what it's doing, recover from the thing that I did that I didn't want to do? All of those are sensations that are created during karting, for example, where somebody learns through repetition, physical repetition, the wiring necessary to be adept with, and what we might even say to build instinct for, reacting in those circumstances, where the online simulated iRacing environment is also capable of doing that. We've talked about since video games were a thing, well, they were good for kids to learn hand-eye coordination, right? They have a controller, there's a thing on the screen, they're learning the interaction between those. Well, iRacing, simulated racing, does that too. Now, you lose a little bit of the physical because of the G-forces and all those things that we've talked about, but there becomes a mental connection to the body through which what the hands and feet are doing is now connected to what the eyes are seeing, and maybe even what the ears are hearing. So we're approximating what you're getting in a race car or in a proper car on a racetrack, but it's not everything. So there's pros and cons here, right? There's a lot that can be gained and a lot of insight that can be learned. A lot that can be accomplished in a simulator. We're huge proponents of it. We think it's more good than it's bad. It's not a complete replacement for the experience that you can get through other means of training or learning how to drive a car or a cart or whatever that mechanism is that gets you from a thing I'm learning how to do to being more adept at doing it.
We're not the only ones that think this. There's people that are way smarter than us, understanding the benefit of simulators in developing young drivers. I mean, Red Bull Oracle, who F1 team, they have a sim team. Like, there's professional simulator race teams. And these big corporations are dumping a bunch of money into these tournaments, races, young kids coming up through the ranks of simulator racing, in hopes that they'll then become their next big driver, whether that's in GT racing or Formula One racing. Like, they see this connection, and I think it's, very prevalent nowadays in racing. We're seeing more and more people that are getting into motorsports of high ranks that have come from a background of sim racing, that they're talking about that their early days of racing, rather than saying that they karted for X amount of time, they were racing on the simulator. They were on iRacing doing tournaments or professional races through iRacing to then get a bunch of wins, to then get an opportunity to get into a real car.
Yeah, to me it's really interesting when you see people doing both. Max Verstappen, Lando Norris. I mean, there's so many of these who are professional race car drivers. They're in Formula One. They're in the highest levels of motorsport. And they also sim race. And maybe they use it for training. Maybe they use it just for fun. But we know, at least in some cases, they're using it as a recruiting ground, training ground, a way to find and spot potential talent for people who maybe haven't had the means or the access or the exposure necessary to get in a proper race car, and maybe create a path for doing that.
Yeah, and Verstappen is, I think, the biggest one that I know of like has the Max Verstappen Racing sim team.
Yes.
And then he also has the Max Verstappen Racing real world racing team, IRL. But he's been taking his sim team, and like, if his drivers are successful with the sim racing team, he then gives them opportunities to jump into a GT3 car. And what he's seen is that it's pretty relatable, right? Of the things that he can do on the simulator, and translates to the real world. If someone's good at driving on the sim, they're going to be decent at driving a car in the real world.
So, Max is seeing this potential in up-and-comers, and there's plenty of other pro racers who are creating these kind of karting teams, sim racing teams, way to identify up-and-coming talent. And it's kind of fun for them, too. I think they just get a charge out of helping to sort of spread their own knowledge and talent to others who, might not have had the opportunities like them.
Hopefully this conversation gets you excited of getting a sim rig of your own, right? Getting into that community of virtual racing, of not just saying like, oh, that's for nerds, right? Like, I only drive in the real world and do track days and stuff. There's so much more to enjoy of getting involved in that community and understanding that there is some benefit to it. And hopefully we'll see you logged in your own little virtual profile out there on the interwebs racing those virtual racetracks.
We'll see you out there trying to build up your iRacing score or whatever it is out there in the lobby waiting for the race to start. It's a really fun environment. The community part of it, don't overlook that. The ability to chat with your friends while you're out on track is something you can't do in the real world. We just don't do that. It's so much fun to be out there complimenting each other, taking pot shots at each other, just being part of something that we're all doing together. And if we build some real skills at the same time, that's awesome. What a fun time to learn and have good time while we're doing it. So yeah, I think there's more to do here. And if you haven't spent the time to learn about it, it's a great time to get involved.
Totally opens up opportunities you wouldn't have in the real world, and further to build that passion for motorsports, racing, cars, all the good stuff.
Yeah, you could say maybe life is iRacing. Everything else is waiting around.
I-waiting? Everything else is I-waiting?
I-waiting in the I-lobby.
All right. Well, this has been a great conversation. Thanks, Todd.
Thanks, Sylas.
And thanks for listening. This has been Cold Start.